Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ultimate Engineer, The Remarkable Life of NASA's Visionary Leader, George M. Low, by Richard Jurek. Foreword by Gerald D. Griffin. Narrated by Mike Chamberlain. Dr. George Low, the guiding light behind the Apollo program, began his career as a research scientist and progressed to key leadership positions in the manned spaceflight program. He continued his lifelong efforts to build a better tomorrow while serving as president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. We're grateful for what George Low has done and the ideas he stood for, and we'll miss him very much. President Ronald Reagan, 20 July 1984. The fundamental operating unit in George Low's NASA experience has always been the team, whether he was a member, contributor, or leader. But without him, those extraordinary teams would have lacked the final sparks of ingenuity, those extra quanta of strength that finally meant success. James C. Fletcher, NASA Administrator. George Low knew as much about technology and about humanity as any man I ever met. But what made him special was that he knew how they fit together, whether in business or education or in leading people in building a spaceship to the moon. Jack Welch, GE Chairman and CEO. He was my favorite engineer. Neil A. Armstrong, NASA astronaut. Foreword. George M. Low was the deputy director of NASA's Johnson Space Center, JSC, when I joined the agency as a flight controller in 1964. He was many pay grades above me. In my eyes, he was a bigger-than-life leader in NASA management. I was familiar with the history of the creation of NASA and knew that George was a key player from the beginning. After the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, I was selected to be a flight director in mission control, and I really got to work closely with George. More importantly, I got to know him on a personal level. George and I would become even closer later in our careers, but I could tell from those early interactions at JSC that he was a special talent and a special person. He was one of my all-time favorites, an inspirational leader, a terrific boss, and an overall great guy. In many ways, George's style reminded me of another NASA legend, Neil Armstrong. Both were not big talkers, but whenever they spoke, everyone in the room got quiet and listened. George had a unique ability to get everyone's input, instantly synthesize and summarize all he heard, and then quickly make a decision. We trusted his decisions. George was a stabilizing force in almost everything we did, especially during the chaotic time right after the Apollo 1 fire. His confident, calm leadership brought all elements of the Apollo program together, and he helped us carry on. I can tell you for sure that everyone in the program wanted to do their best for George, because no one wanted to let him down. In my opinion, that is the hallmark of a truly great leader. George was one of the hardest-working people I have ever known. I had the feeling that he probably didn't sleep very much. His days were very long, but he kept on going, always confident and inspiring. George was NASA's deputy administrator by the time the last Apollo mission was flown. He called me up to Washington to run NASA's Office of Legislative Affairs and to work with him on Capitol Hill. We were trying to keep the space shuttle on track and funded. George really was the go-to guy in Washington on the shuttle. We spent a lot of time on the Hill, explaining the shuttle, but we also covered topics that addressed NASA's programs in aeronautics, space science and technology, and research. George was on top of everything. When Apollo ended, we came pretty close to losing the shuttle and perhaps losing the entire manned spaceflight program. George played a huge role in saving the shuttle and getting us going again on all fronts. He didn't do it alone, but without George, NASA's future would have been bleak at best. George left NASA in 1976 to be the president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and it was about the same time I left NASA headquarters. The next time I saw him, unfortunately, would be the last. I had returned to JSC as the center director, following Chris Kraft when he retired. George was then under treatment for a recurrence of melanoma at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. My wife and I went there to visit him. I remember how very thin he was, but his spirits were high, and he greeted us warmly. He was determined not to let the cancer beat him, and his focus was firmly set on the future. I'll never forget what he said during our visit. "Jerry, I'll be flying on the shuttle one of these days." Unfortunately, he died shortly thereafter, leaving us at far too young an age. But in many ways, his spirit would go on to fly the shuttle. It was a program, like Apollo, that George helped bring about by his sheer force of will and dedicated hard work. And, of course, his son, G. David Lowe, who looked and talked much like his father, would go on to fly 3 successful shuttle flights. I am sure George flew in spirit on every one of those missions. Too few people know or understand the important impact George Lowe had on the U.S. space program, let alone who he was as a person and the many great things that he accomplished during his life. He was never one to pursue the limelight, but he worked tirelessly and passionately behind the scenes to get us to the moon and back, and to bridge the difficult transition of NASA in a post-Apollo world. I shudder to think what might have happened to NASA and our space program without him. It is my sincere hope that George's unique and remarkable story will inspire you to support this nation's continued efforts to lead the world in the peaceful exploration of space. It would be a fitting tribute to a man who dedicated his life to the same cause. We need more George Lowes in this world. Gerald D. Griffin. Imagination has let us set our foot on the moon and our minds on the stars, gives us the hope for the future, a sense of direction, but it takes much more to reach our destination. It takes knowledge and courage and confidence. Above all, the confidence to be willing to take risks. Yet today, much of our society has an aversion to risk. People are afraid of science and technology, of where our experiments might lead us, afraid of the unknown and of the future. But if we are unwilling to venture, there can be no hope. Without risk, there can be no progress. George M. Lowe, Inaugural Address, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Troy, New York, 8 October 1976. Introduction. George M. Lowe once described himself as a dirty hands engineer. He said he wanted to be an engineer before he even knew what it meant to be one. In 1968, during the build-up to the historic Apollo 8 circumlunar flight, Lowe explained what he meant by this description to World Book writer and space-age chronicler William Furlong. "I've always been interested in getting my hands dirty," said Lowe. "From as early as I can remember, I liked to fix things and take things apart. I liked to get out on the floor and look at things for myself and find out how they work and why they're being put together that way." Furlong's syndicated profile of Lowe appeared in hundreds of newspapers, along with a photograph of Lowe in his office at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas. He is sitting at a long table filled with toggle switches and various machine parts from the Apollo spacecraft. Lowe kept these parts on hand to troubleshoot potential problems and design changes as he personally took on the critical task of redesigning the Apollo spacecraft after the deadly AS-204 Apollo 1 fire in 1967. The fire cost the nation 3 precious lives and put the whole space program in doubt. After the fire, NASA management called on Lowe to do the seemingly impossible. They asked him to bridge the anger, distrust, and animosity within Houston and bring the team back together to achieve their collective goal of landing a man on the moon. The secret of Apollo's success is paying attention to infinitesimal detail all the time, Lowe told New York Times science reporter Walter Sullivan. With over 15 million individual piece parts in the spacecraft and rocket, it's not the big problems an engineer had to worry about. Those were obvious. Rather, it is the seemingly insignificant, a faulty toggle switch, damaged or frayed wiring, the wrong person in the wrong job. The work involved in safely getting a human being on the moon and back by the end of the decade would prove to be immense, and it would test Lowe and the entire NASA team to their limits. But, in the end, they succeeded. And they succeeded in no small part because of George Lowe. He often attributed his obsessive, hands-on work ethic as an engineer and a manager to his desire to know as much as possible about any given issue or situation. He abhorred the myopic limits of a single vantage point. As a result, he worked long hours. "I have always worked a little harder than most," he said. "I know some people who seem to have the utmost of self-confidence that whatever they start and whatever they do, they will do well. I've seen people like that fail, and fail very badly. I am not that sure of myself. I know my limitations." Despite the heavy, self-inflicted workload, Lowe never complained. He knew that lives depended on the thoroughness of the work. He believed that any failure was often predicated by the principal actors not asking the right questions at the right time. "I think the kind of question one has to ask, the motivation one has to have, and every decision one has to make," Lowe once said, "has to be based on the knowledge that one day you will have to tell the person who is going to fly the machine, 'I've done the best job I know how to do for you. I put myself ahead, in time, not space, and say, if I make that decision in this way today, how will I feel at midnight in the Mission Control Center during the flight if something goes wrong?'" Lowe professed not to remember much about his formative years growing up in Austria. It was a conscious decision on his part not to share those precious memories, even if he remembered more than he publicly revealed. He much preferred to talk about the present and the future rather than the past. He was very much a visionary, said G. David Lowe, his son and space shuttle astronaut. That was probably one of his best traits. The way I describe him is that he could see around corners. I don't know anybody who can see around corners the way he could. Eva, his sister, recalls a memory of Lowe back in Austria as an inquisitive young boy, spending countless hours playing with his Mercury erector set, building his own versions of the machines and equipment he saw on their father's farm. There is a treasured family photo capturing such a moment. It shows Lowe as a dapper young boy sitting at a table in the mid-1930s. He is patiently assembling what looks like a large motorized tractor wheel. His mouth is slightly agape in a satisfied half-smile. He exhibits the same contented demeanor as he does in the World Book profile photo only 30 years later, a man completely absorbed by and at peace in the details of the work at hand. That was George Lowe, and this is his story. 1. New Beginnings. George Lowe, née Georg Löw, was born in Vienna, Austria, on 10 June 1926. He came into the world during a violent, tumultuous time of geopolitical and social change, between two destructive world wars that would shape the ultimate destiny of his life in a myriad of ways. At the time, aviation was still in its early infancy, and modern rocketry was only a few months old. Global military conflict would propel the world into a new age of rocketry and aeronautics. It would unleash not only immense destruction, but also rapid innovation and technological advancement. Indeed, the Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk just 23 years prior, and already Lindbergh was planning for the first solo Atlantic crossing in 1927. 3 months before Lowe's birth, Robert H. Goddard, the founding father of modern rocketry, had launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket in Auburn, Massachusetts, on 16 March 1926. By the time Lowe himself would become a young aeronautical engineer a few short decades later, the aviation industry would be pushing the boundaries on altitude, speed, and distance with both planes and rockets, yearning to go to the planets and the stars beyond. Within the fullness of time, albeit half a world away, and in completely different circumstances from the life in which he was born, Lowe himself would become one of the world's greatest and most accomplished aeronautical engineers. He spent his youth in Ungarn, Austria, a small, picturesque market town on the Morava River. It is located some 25 miles northeast of the capital, Vienna. Tall and thin for his age, the brown-haired, brown-eyed boy was known to be a private, introspective child. Whether riding a pony around the family farm, playing with his beloved toy train set, or building motorized machines with his metal erector set, Lowe was always intently focused on and absolutely absorbed by whatever it was that he was doing. Part of a wealthy and influential Austrian family of means and reputation, Lowe was also brought up in an environment that embraced education, innovation, and industry. He learned English at an early age. Beginning in 1929, he had an English teacher 1 day a week. Over the course of the next 8 years, he learned English through a form of language immersion in which the teacher talked to him in English, pointing out whatever it was she was describing. Increasing his English exposure, she also substituted for his governess whenever she was on vacation. A quick study, he advanced his language skills rapidly. He attended grade school in Vienna in the 1930s, and then the Franz Josef Realgymnasium, a middle school, in 1936 and 1937. During this time, the family owned significant real estate and agribusiness interests in and around Vienna. The brothers Wilhelm and Gustav Loewe, his grandfather and great-uncle, respectively, were born in the late 1800s in what is now recognized as the Czech Republic. At the turn of the 20th century, they migrated from the Slovakian town of Vyshkov to the eastern industrial region of Vienna in search of a better life. The brothers were successful hay and grain traders and instantly capitalized on the fertile farmland in and around Ungarn. In 1909, they built the largest and most modern distillery in the Habsburg Empire. By 1915, they expanded the distillery with a state-of-the-art cannery and refinery. Establishing Austria's only fertilizer factory shortly thereafter, they began recycling the plant and livestock bio-waste from the farm. Soon, they began exporting fertile potash to as far away as Egypt, the Middle East, and the United States, as well as cultivating rare plant seeds. In just a few short decades, the Loewe family had become a global agribusiness, one of the largest industrial concerns in Austria. As part of their real estate holdings, they acquired Ungarn Castle, which became Lowe's childhood home. Along with its purchase, the family inherited the feudal title of Grundherrn, a medieval landed estate title that granted them patronage rights over the area. By most accounts, the Loews took their responsibilities seriously and acted on them with humility and respect. They were especially generous in relation to the local Catholic Church and Cloister Mauerbach, a monastery founded in 1313, as well as with the families that worked their farms and in their factories. The Loewe family built and renovated apartments and houses for their employees. They also helped out socially. For example, whenever a family was expecting a baby, they would receive a Kinderpaket. This was a gift package filled with household necessities for raising the child. Every December, they hosted a Christmas party for the entire town. All the children of Ungarn received a gift box filled with baked goods, fresh fruit, and a new pair of shoes. As the family's success and influence grew, so too did its reputation and standing in Viennese society. Lowe's father, Artua, and his aunt, Mariana, studied together at the University of Vienna. While studying, Artua met Gertruda, Lowe's mother. All three eventually graduated with their doctorates, Artua in chemistry, Mariana in economics, and Gertruda in liberal arts. Over the years, the family became friends and contemporaries with other famous Viennese, such as the Kinski family, one of the noble Austro-Hungarian families dating back to 1237, and the Bloch-Bauers, another wealthy family with whom the Loews eventually partnered as fellow stock owners in the country's largest sugar factory. The Louvre's influence also expanded to the realm of politics. It was not uncommon, for example, for the Chancellor of Austria, Dr. Kurt von Schuschnigg, to be a dinner guest at their home. Among the family's many economic interests, Artua and Gertrude specifically focused their expertise on running the agribusiness. Professionally, they were interested in improving seed productivity and crop yields. They worked with scientists at the University of Vienna and elsewhere to develop better seeds, farming practices, and pest control. During visits to the Ungern Castle, many of the nation's leading agricultural scientists often joined the family for lunch and extensive conversations. Lowe and his siblings were often present at the table. During his formative years, he absorbed, if not directly, then indirectly, a lifelong passion for business and the sciences at the feet of some of the best minds in all of Europe. He developed a passion for machines by being around the farm equipment, getting his hands dirty out in the fields. And he watched and learned as his mother took over the family business when Artua died of cancer in 1934 at the young age of 33, a precursor to the dramatic change his life would undertake during the coming years. On the evening of 11 March 1938, Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg resigned under direct threat of invasion by Adolf Hitler, setting the dramatic stage for a bloodless coup and the Anschluss, the annexation of the country into Nazi Germany. Hitler, an Austrian by birth, wanted to unify the two Germanic nations. He also desperately coveted Austria's rich raw resources, skilled labor, industrial factories, and gold and foreign currency reserves. The Louvre's diversified industrial holdings and extensive wealth ranked them at the top of the Nazis' target list. While the family had Jewish blood lineage, they neither identified as Jewish nor practiced the Jewish religion. Still, they were classified by the Nazi state as Jewish under the Nuremberg laws. In Nuremberg, Germany, in 1935, the Nazi Party created a set of laws on citizenship and race. These laws dictated that anyone who had 3 or 4 grandparents of Jewish descent was determined to be a Jew, regardless of whether they practiced another religion or no religion at all. After the annexation of Austria by Hitler in early 1938, the Nazis imposed the Nuremberg laws on Austrian citizens. Those classified as Jewish were denied full citizenship rights and were banned from certain professions, schools, and ownership of certain businesses, a development that had a significant impact on the Louvres. It was the basis for their ultimate journey to America, a journey that would stretch out almost 2 years because of strict U.S. immigration quotas at the time. The day after the Anschluss, a relentless campaign against Austrian Jews, Catholics, and pro-independence supporters began. Within days, the Louvre's businesses were seized by the Vermögensverkehrsstelle, a new government agency established by the Nazis to seize control of assets. On threat of imprisonment, Gertrude and the family were forbidden to enter or participate in the activities of their various businesses. While they were not explicitly confined to their homes, their activities were restricted. Although Lowe was allowed to attend school, he caught scarlet fever in April, which resulted in officials placing all of Ungarn under quarantine for 6 weeks, delaying the Vermögensverkehrsstelle from conducting an on-site inventory of the family's property and assets. When the quarantine was lifted, their personal assets were seized, including furniture, artworks, and everything down to the silverware in the kitchen and most of their jewelry. They were evicted from Ungern Castle and moved into an apartment in Vienna in the same building where Mariana, Lowe's aunt, was living. In due course, the family's personal and business assets were auctioned off by court order to compensate the Reich for millions of fictitious back taxes. By no sheer coincidence, the amount due by the family equaled, down to the pfennig, the total amount of their net worth. To ensure cooperation, Nazi authorities confiscated the family's passports, which they were willing to ransom back and allow passage out of the country in exchange for the balance of their overseas assets. with conditions worsening by the day, especially for those classified under the Nuremberg laws as Jewish. The family was left with little choice. They acquiesced, instructing their overseas bankers to transfer the money. Shortly thereafter, most of the family, including his grandfather and grandmother, Wilhelm and Franziska Löw, his uncle, Gustav Löw, and his aunt, Marianne Hamburger Löw, boarded a crowded train for Switzerland, but not before Gertrude extended help to other family associates, friends, and co-workers. Even after leaving Austria, Gertrude continued to help those she could in escaping Nazi-occupied Austria. She couldn't help everyone, but she helped as many as she could. As fate would have it, the family left barely 1 month before Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, a violent uprising against Jews on the night of 9 November 1938. It is considered by many to be the beginning of the Holocaust. Once out of Austria, they made their way to England after an 8-month stay in Switzerland. In pre-Blitzkrieg London, they roomed for a short 3-month period in an apartment at Queen's Gate Garden at about the time when World War II officially began in September 1939. As a result of the war, the family was evacuated to Dorset in late January 1940. During this time, Lowe attended several private boarding schools in both Switzerland and England. In Switzerland, he attended Institut Montana Zutgerberg, an international English-speaking school. In England, he attended St. Paul's School in West Kensington before transferring to Claysmore in Dorset at the start of the war. Despite all the disruption, his report cards from the period show solid academic performance, a consistent ability to make friends, and an affinity for woodworking and shop classes. He loved to work with his hands. The family's stay in both Switzerland and England were not without additional personal loss, however. Lowe's grandmother, Fanny, died in Switzerland, and Gustav would take ill, later dying in England. Finally, in early 1940, as the war intensified and the conditions in England grew dire, the family's visas came through. They boarded the SS Veendam in Southampton on Friday, 26 January 1940, to begin their passage to America. Also on board were grateful survivors of the Dutch SS Simon Bolivar, the first neutral ship sunk by German magnetic mines dropped into British coastal waters by the Luftwaffe. The ship's sinking, just weeks before the Veendam's departure, claimed 126 civilian lives. It was undoubtedly the subject of many late-night cabin whispers and nervous conversations aboard the Veendam as they made their way from port out to sea. Due to the growing threat of mines along the main shipping routes, the Holland-America line engaged 2 British minesweepers to escort the Veendam on its journey. On the first couple of nights of their voyage, the ship had to drop anchor and remain completely dark and still until daylight. They were avoiding not only mines, but also Luftwaffe air raids. While their voyage may have been filled with a number of grim threats of the war, the conditions they left behind were no better. In wartime England, everyday essentials like food and clothing were rationed. Gas masks were standard issue and served as daily reminders of the horrors and destruction that German V-2 rockets would rain from the sky. In stark contrast, life aboard the Veendam provided a welcome respite. Its ample amenities were more befitting vacationers and leisure travelers than its current cadre of refugees and immigrants fleeing the war. A double-stacked, 4-deck passenger liner, the ship was outfitted with luxury staterooms and broad promenade decks. Food was plentiful. The onboard cinema even featured the recently released The Wizard of Oz. One can only imagine the impression this film might have made on a young Lowe, as well as on the other war-shocked passengers, especially upon hearing Judy Garland singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. It is not hard to imagine Lowe standing out on one of the ship's long promenade decks at night, gazing up at the stars, perhaps wondering what his future in this uncertain world might hold. Nights out at sea would have revealed a star field to Lowe like none he had ever seen before. What awaited him on the other side of this dark, churning sea?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?